Yes,
Yeah?
I think we're good to go.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, almost evening. I am Ruben Aurelio, superintendent. For all of you who might not know who I am, I want to just start off by saying thank you to the committee members for one, applying and to be on this committee, but also the hard work ahead of the committee. As you'll see, we have 4 meetings scheduled for this work. And you're going to be tasked with some very important decisions around just prioritizing our schools as we look at school closures and consolidations as well as property. So we thank you. It's going to be some good work. I'm going to remind us all to use the microphones. We'll have to share, but we want to make sure that your voice is captured as we are recording this and making it available to anyone who wants to view it at a later date. I know Hillary is absent. She reached out. She's going to want to watch the recording, so that way when she comes to the next meeting, she is not behind.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much. All right, well, I'm going to call the meeting to order, and I just want to give a brief introduction to the committee. So my name is Sarah Polito. I'm a business and facilities attorney that works with the district, and my role really with the committee is just to kind of be the master of ceremonies, kind of guide you through the process as far as procedure and then some of the content. And then at the end of this meeting, you all will elect folks internally to kind of help the running of the meetings as we continue. So you will have a chairperson that will do the majority of the calling to order, the calling for votes, the motion and second, and we can walk through all of that procedure as we get there. Another thing as far as logistics, so each of you have a binder that we've prepped that has all the materials for the meeting, the agenda, the PowerPoint, the resolution, some Q&As about the committee and its function. Our plan is to collect those at the end of each meeting, and then we'll put in the new materials for the following meeting and then pass them back out to you. So if you would, at the end of the meeting, just drop your name tag either into the back cover or the front envelope, and then we'll just make sure to get you back that same binder just in case you have notes or anything that you've taken inside of it during the meetings. Okay, so let's jump into roll call. I'm going to call out our 10 members. I know there's only 6 of you here. If I mispronounce your name or you'd like to go by a nickname or a different name, please let me know. And I think I'm going to give you this mic while we do this.
And just a bit of housekeeping. Restrooms are right outside these doors if anyone needs it.
I'm just going to set the mic here, and if you guys can pass it around as I call names, that would be wonderful. All right, so Hillary Baird, I know she is absent. Hazel Wilson, she is also absent. Kimberly Marquez Cortez, also absent. T. Lek Ying, not here. Marnie McKenzie. Marnie, thank you. Hold on, let me write that so I get that right. Okay. Christy Gardner.
Present.
Thank you. R. Shay Miles. Thank you. Sandra Stevens.
Present.
Thank you. Kathleen Solis Tietgen.
Present.
And Yvonne Wheeler.
Ivana. Present.
Ivana. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have 6 present out of 10, so we have quorum and we'll get started. Are there any public comments or public note cards? Thank you. Okay, so we're going to move forward with the committee orientation based around the PowerPoint that I prepared, and a lot of what you'll see today is really about the procedure and the function of the committee, just so everyone kind of understands not only what the responsibilities and the goals of the committee are, but also how we're going to operate these meetings and what will happen at each meeting, and then finally we'll talk about the properties that have been assigned for your review. Okay, so overview of the next 90 minutes to 2 hours. So we're going to do the 7-Eleven committee orientation, and that includes introduction to the Ralph M. Brown Act, conflicts of interest, the PRA, and then Robert's Rules of Order, introduction to the properties and district goals, and then discuss additional logistics for future meetings. And I will say, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand. More than happy to make this a conversation as we go through. You don't need to save everything to the end. Okay, so what is a 7-Eleven committee? A 7-Eleven committee is a cross-section of the community that is supposed to be like representative of the folks that live within the district, that needs to have at least 7 but no more than 11 members, hence the name. And it involves the community in decisions regarding use of property. And so the education code requires that we convene a 7-Eleven before we surplus property, so we dispose of it, such as like long-term lease or a sale of property. But it's also a best practice from the California Department of Education to convene a 7-Eleven to give advice to the board about a closure of schools. And so we're going to talk in a bit more detail on the next slide about exactly what the board has tasked you all with doing. And there's kind of a two-part ask. One has to do with about deciding whether a site is surplus and should be leased long-term or sold, for example. And then the other is to give us a rank order list of if schools need to be closed, what would the priority be, right? So you're not being asked to decide on closures, but rather look at various factors about the individual school sites and decide if you had to create a list from the site that you would most want closed to the site that you would least want closed, how would we order those sites that are being that you are being asked to review? Okay, so a little bit more about the process. So your duties that are listed in the education code are to review information to determine the amount of surplus space, to provide for a public hearing for community input, and to develop recommendations. So at our third meeting, there will be a public hearing agendized. So all of these meetings are available for the public to attend, just as a board meeting would be. And we're always going to have an opportunity for the public to make a comment, like we just held a minute ago. But at your third meeting, there will also be a public hearing. That will be kind of a separate, like designated time for members of the community to comment on the draft of the board, or the draft of the committee report, rather. So at our next meeting, we'll be looking at a draft report, and it's just going to first be kind of the framework, and then you all are going to add the content in. And then during our third meeting, that report will have been made available to the public, and then we'll receive comments on the report during the third meeting that has the public hearing. And then the final piece is just to remember, you're just developing a set of recommendations. So you're not being asked to instruct the board to do anything. You are looking at a set of information and data that's being provided by staff, and then providing recommendations to the board for them to consider when they're thinking about making their decisions. Okay, so I said before that there's kind of a two-part goal that the board has assigned, and in your binder is the resolution that was passed by the board earlier this month that gave the instruction not only for the creation of the committee, but also the members were designated, and then all of the properties that are being reviewed were also assigned for committee review in that resolution. So if you ever have question or concern about where did my authority come from to do what we're being asked to do, it's from that particular board resolution. And there, so what exactly is the board saying in that resolution? They're asking for two things. The first is, of the 7 sites that have been assigned on that list, we would like to have those rank ordered, as I mentioned, that if schools need to be closed, and we know that some do need to be for budgeting priorities and other reasons, if they need to be, we were going to rank order them from the site that you would most want to see to the site that you would least want to see closed. And then the second ask is there's a subset of those properties, just a few of them that we're going to talk about in a slide or two, that of those, are they surplus? So are these really sites that the district doesn't need anymore? They're just kind of extra land or property that so on some of them, you will see there's kind of a question, if that school is closed, does that site then become surplus, right? So there may be, like right now it may be functional, but we would kind of have to make an assumption, if it's closed, is it then surplus to the needs of the district? And that gives staff and the board the ability to make a decision about whether the site should then be long-term leased or sold. Any questions about that? I just want to pause there for a minute. None yet, okay. Okay, so because in that, as you've seen in the resolution, the board essentially created this committee or this like subcommittee. The committee acts under essentially the same rules that the Board of Education acts under, right? So one of the first laws that we operate under is the Brown Act, and this is the open meetings law in California that has requirements for when public meetings are convened and how they're convened, and then how the public has to be given access to those meetings. So there are kind of four main components of these rules, and the first is that we have to have an agenda that gets posted publicly a certain number of hours before the meeting. We have to hold meetings in front of the public, except for in the event of some exceptions. So for the Board of Education, you may have heard of closed session, and we won't have any closed sessions here because there won't be any topics that you're asked to provide recommendations on that would fit into any of those exceptions. But that's kind of how those rules fit into this context. We're going to always receive the comments of the public during those times that we designate, and then separately during public hearings when we have them. And then the whole kind of linchpin of these laws is the idea of transparency, that our goal is for the public to know what's being discussed at these meetings and then have an opportunity to participate in those discussions. Okay, so from a more like practical perspective, people that don't have a lot of experience normally with the Brown Act or with the Board of Education will usually ask, well, what does it mean to have a meeting, and like how do these rules apply to our discussion as a committee, either in this room or outside of this room? So the Brown Act applies to meetings of a legislative body. You all are a legislative body because the board has appointed you to be so. All meetings of that body are public, and official business must be transacted at a public meeting. The only exception we have is closed session. So the definition of a meeting is when a majority of members gather at the same time and place to hear, discuss, or deliberate on any item within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. So what does that mean? It means when at least the majority of the members of the committee, right? So like here we have 6 out of 10, so we have a quorum, are in the same place to talk about topics that have been assigned for that body, right? So any of the things that the board appointed this committee to do, those would all be things within the subject matter jurisdiction of the committee. Okay, so what does this matter for your life? What matters is that technically we can't have you having a meeting outside of this room without an agenda. So for example, say that we finish this meeting and you're all walking to your cars in the parking lot, and you know, a thought comes to you about the agenda, and you just kind of happen to start walking together, and then you start a conversation, and a number of you start to talk about some of the topics that happened at the meeting. Inadvertently, we may have now convened a second meeting that the public doesn't know about, and we weren't able to have an agenda and have it be apparent that folks could be there to make comment. And so practically, we just ask that you don't communicate or decide or deliberate or discuss any of the items that are on the agenda or have to do with the committee outside of this room, so that we don't accidentally violate the Brown Act. One of the things to know is that this applies online as well. So to the extent that you are active on social media and you're exchanging comments or notes or pictures or any other form of media that can be shared on social media, it has been found that if a majority of the members are all like commenting on the same feed, for example, that can even be a meeting. So we just have to be really careful about not engaging in discussion of the matters of the committee while we're not in this room. Okay, the other thing is that there's something called a serial meeting, which is when not all of you are in the same place or on the same like social media feed, for example, but there's a chain of communications, right? So if the first member shares what they think with the second member and the second member shares what both of them think with the third member, you can have individual like one-on-one communications that still in the cumulative create a serial meeting and then can be in violation of the Brown Act. So again, another practical example of being careful about communicating about committee business while not within the meeting room during the agendized time. Okay. All right, so you will notice that all of our meetings will be based around the agenda. And the goal of the agenda, which is the first item in your binder, is to not only make sure that we do all of the things required by the law at these meetings, but also to give us some, form and shape and structure to the order and the procedure of the meetings. So there will always be an agenda. It will be posted 72 hours in advance of the meeting. It will include the time and place of the meeting, and then identify the business being discussed or transacted. So any item that we're going to discuss as a committee will be on the agenda, and then any item that we're going to act on will also be identified in the agenda as an action item. So that, for example, like you can see in our in our agenda for tonight, there are notes under each item where we need a motion, a second, and then the full vote of the committee. And then it's always going to be posted for the public to see in advance of the meeting. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, these meetings are going to be open to the public just as a board meeting would be. And they're subject to reasonable regulation. The public has to be allowed to speak on any subject on the agenda, open or closed, or within the subject matter jurisdiction of the legislative body. So what's the practical takeaway here? It's that anyone from the public can come to these meetings and talk about anything on the agenda or anything that's not on the agenda, as long as it's within the subject matter jurisdiction of the committee. So it's has to do with the task that you've been asked to do as committee members. Now, the committee can only speak to things that are on the agenda, though. So if you have someone from the public that were to come up and have a comment about something that's not on the agenda, we hear it, we receive it as staff, and then it can be brought back for discussion at a later agenda, but the committee can really only speak to and discuss and transact about things that are on the agenda itself. So there may be times when you have a member of the public that will have a comment, and we don't have the ability to respond or to discuss that within the content of the meeting in which that comment is made. Okay, the next aspect is to know that all of the documents created by the committee, for the exception of some like personal notes, are documents that are public records, right? So they could be discoverable by the public based in a Public Records Act request. All the documents that are distributed to the committee less than 72 hours prior to the meeting have to also be made available. So say, for example, we didn't make the PowerPoint available with the agenda. If I make that available to you during the meeting, we're also going to always have a stack of those documents available for the public. We list on the agenda the location of where the item can be viewed, or that can also be posted on a website, and then all documents are public, subject to disclosure through the PRA. So that's just kind of a note to think about like what's in writing and what's done as a part of the committee is all subject to public disclosure potentially. All right, so a little bit more procedure. So Robert's Rules of Order are kind of informal rules of procedure. They're not in the law anywhere, but most boards adopt them to kind of help us know how we operate and how each member of the committee can speak and vote and what rights you have to make motions or defer items. This is Robert, the man that created these rules, and they've continued to evolve over the past 100 or so, plus years. And so these rules address things like we have to have a quorum to begin, right? So like tonight, there are 10 members on the committee. We had to have at least 6 of you to start. Otherwise, the operation of the committee doesn't really have any meaning or function. The next one is voting. So you'll notice that the way that we will proceed with items where we take action is we're always going to ask for a motion, and someone will say, I motion. We're always going to ask for a second, and so someone else has to second the motion, and then we'll take a vote. And for the purposes of getting everyone's vote down, I'll call you each by name, and you'll say yes or no, yay or nay, so that we can take a vote. And that's just kind of the 3-point procedure that we'll use for every action item that we're taking as the committee. And then rights to make a motion. So I can't say there's a whole lot of making of motions, usually like during the 7-Eleven committee, but you do have the ability, for example, say that we get to a particular item where we are voting on the election of the committee chairperson, and we decide to we get a motion for Sandra to be the chairperson, for example, and then someone gets a second. And then maybe another member says, well, I'd like to motion to like table the prior motion. There's different things that you can do if you don't wish to vote yet on that motion, if you want to hear that motion later. I would say for the purposes of this committee, if you want something to be done and you're not quite sure how to do it, you could just raise your hand and let me know, and we'll work through the procedure together. But that's kind of the general idea of how we take and use motions. Okay, so one of the other pieces that is really important to know is that there are all of these rules about conflicts of interest. And so because you are technically serving as a public official in your role as an appointed committee member, we want to make sure that we don't either have current conflicts of interest or create any conflicts of interest that could arise later in this process. So things that could come up. If there was, the intent by a committee member to serve as a broker for the district with regard to a sale or lease of one of these properties, by being a committee member, you may later be not be eligible to have one of those roles as a contracted district, like contractor, right? Because of your role in making a decision or providing a recommendation to the board about the potential sale or lease of that property. Also, if it just so happens that there's any, like financial interest that you were to have in any of these properties, that would be something else that could be a conflict of interest. So if there's anything, again, they're not common in the context of a 7-Eleven committee, but say, you were a part of you owned shares in a company that had an interest in a school site, for example, which there's very few cases in which that would happen. We would want to have a conversation about, is there an actual like financial conflict of interest in you being on the committee and making a recommendation to the board? So it's something that we mention, although it's pretty remote, just in case there is anyone that thinks that there could be either a financial or potential contractual like conflict of interest in your involvement. Okay, so this is just kind of reiterating the same point that the goal is transparency and members should seek to avoid a bias or a potential conflict, right? The goal in your function as a committee is to work as a body for what's in the best interest of the district. So part of the goal is to really separate, your personal feeling about something and really act as a body in what's in the best interest of the board and the district. And most conflicts are unintentional and can be avoided with precaution. So if there's anything that comes to mind, you can feel free to flag me down and we can talk through it. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the individual properties. Why does this not have the map? Give me 1 second. Doesn't make sense. Well, let's just move to the list of sites. So the prior slide was supposed to have a map of the boundaries of the district, which you can see in the printout. Okay, good. So the map of the boundaries of the district, the goal there is to just show you where all of the sites, all of the current district sites, school sites are located, right? So one of the first things that we often hear from the committee is help us kind of like visually see where the different school sites are that we are being asked to review and kind of how they relate to each other on the map and then within the school district as a whole. So you'll see there's a key on the bottom left, and then there are 7 sites that are being that have been called out by the board for your review, and these are the 7 sites listed here. I'll run through their location on the map, and then at our next meeting, I'll make sure that we have a highlighted map that kind of shows you visually where they all are. But Federal Terrace is number 4, Cooper's number 2, Highlands number 6, Pennycook is 14, Stephen Manor is 16, Finney is 9, and Lincoln is 10. So if that helps, those are the 7 sites that the board has kind of asked you to review. And then, again, kind of going back to what the request is. The request is if these sites had to be closed, right? If one or more had to be closed, what would your priority ranking of those be? From the site that you would most want to see to the site that you would least want to see closed. And so when we develop the final report for the board that has your recommendation, the result will be this list of these sites in that order from 1 to 7. Okay, and then the other ask is, well, so this actually has to do with the first. So what I was trying to do here is to kind of create a visual of what would these potential consolidations and closures look like, and where would kids from these schools be relocated to if there was a closure that would happen. And so these are all of the iterations of those 7 sites that we have been able to think of so far that we think are doable potentially based on some of the additional data and information that we're going to present to you at the next meeting and the 3rd meeting. So I'm just going to walk through this so we can get kind of the basic idea of what these shapes and colors mean. So at your top left here, if Lincoln were to close, right, you could relocate students to Federal Terrace, Highland, or Cooper, or kind of any number or like iteration of those sites, right? So not all students would have to go to one. You could designate certain grade levels to go to one or to the other. Same with Federal Terrace, right? It's the same 3 options, but you would do a different iteration of the rearranging of those kids to those 3 other school sites. Oh.
So the printout's a little different than what's shown here. This is an earlier version. Okay. So can I share this one? Yeah.
Perfect. And do you want to walk through? Or do you want me to walk through? Okay. Okay. So same idea with Lincoln and Federal Terrace, and then Highland and Cooper are kind of the two other options there. And then below we have Stephen and Pennycook, right? So the idea is that if we closed Pennycook, the kids could be moved to consolidate to Stephen. And then if we closed Stephen, the kids could be moved over to consolidate to Pennycook. And then on the bottom right, you see there's the Finney complex, right, which has, I believe, 5 different programs that operate out of Finney. And so you could move, say, for example, you closed Stephen and the kids were moved to Pennycook, you could move all of the Finney programs to Stephen, kind of the flip with Pennycook, right? So that could be another open site for the Finney programs. They could also be combined with the program currently at Vallejo High or at Jesse Bethel. And then that 5th option is to move the programs individually. So the 4 that are shown there would be moving all of the programs to a single one of those sites. The 5th option is moving those programs individually to one of those 4 sites or potentially other sites that we haven't specifically identified here on the slide. Yes. I did. Oh, yes. Sorry. Can you just ask one
The
more time?
top row.
Yes.
Just some clarity on that top row.
Yeah. So, and correct me
and I
if
can
I'm.
jump in too.
Okay.
if you
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Are you specifically looking at the Highland and Cooper?
Cooper.
Yes.
Okay. So Highland and Cooper, they're not necessarily like the Pennycook Stephen. So Pennycook and Stephen, due to proximity, if we were to close one of those sites, we would essentially be consolidating those 2 schools into one. Whereas Highland and Cooper, if let's say we decided to close Highland, it's not a straight consolidation with Cooper. It's just redrawing boundaries, and those kids, depending on where they live relative to Highland, they might go north, they might go east, west. It would be a redrawing of boundaries. So it's a little different than Penny and Stephen, where you can consolidate those because of proximity. So similar with Cooper. If Cooper was on the list to close, we would have to redraw boundaries and redistribute students based on proximity to other schools.
So it's just not identified. I was making sure I wasn't missing anything, but
Yeah, so
Okay,
it would really be specific to those
Remapping.
families at Cooper based on where they live. We would have, if Cooper went away, we would redraw the boundaries of the neighboring schools they might go north, they might go based on where they live.
Thank you. Okay. And so just to clarify too about what's in the report, right? So again, these are the sites that have been identified as that kind of rank order list from 1 to 7. You don't necessarily need to be giving instruction to the board about which of these like iterations would be preferred, right? Or like which of these options you are recommending. It's more of just we wanted to give this information to give you an idea of what the like relocation options would look like, right? Say you have one site at the top that was your of the 7, this is the one that we would most prefer be closed. This is some context that would be helpful to you in deciding, well, how might we rank order these from 1 to 7, and what would the implication of a potential closure of that site mean as far as relocation of students? Yes.
So I don't know if this question is a little bit too much detail
Okay.
or not.
Go ahead.
So has the enrollment been pulled for each of these schools to see if the children at the school are at their home school?
If the children at the school are at their home school. Tell me what you mean.
So specific, like, give me a school. It's like,
So not 100% of each student is at their home school. For example, Pennycook, some students have been transferred there because they choose to go there and their transfer was accepted. So my question is, that's a that's just a known fact that not 100% of the students that live in that neighborhood, those children go there.
I see.
So my question is the population been figured out?
So I'll answer initially and then feel free to clarify. At our next meeting, we're going to have enrollment information about how many kids are enrolled at each site and then what the capacity is at any number of these other schools, right, for receipt of those students. And I'll note that you're asking not only how many kids are enrolled, but for how many of those kids enrolled is that their home school, or how many of those kids are attending a school that is out of their home boundary.
So when we did this last year, in the first phase, this was coupled with an equity impact analysis report. That report is also going to be developed for this phase of closures and consolidations. One of the factors we looked at specifically last year with Mare Island Health and Fitness was a plot map of where the students lived in relation to the school. So Mare Island Health and Fitness Academy, what we realized is there was very few students attending that school that actually lived on the island. So that's something we can look at as we get in deeper when we do the equity impact analysis, specifically for, say, a Pennycook or a Stephen, which are neighborhood schools for the most part. How many intra-district transfers do we have at that school?
Okay, so then going to so those two slides were really about the first of the two parts, right, of the task that you've been asked to look at. The second is, should, of these 4 sites, right, if any of these are closed, should they be declared as surplus? And so what that means specifically is, are they kind of extra to the needs of the district? Are they sites that should be long-term leased and or sold to potentially bring in additional revenue or additional monies for the district? And so this is looking at things like if there are certain programs that like may be needed, where else can they be housed? Or are these sites really, really needed to currently deliver instruction to students?
And you'll notice that there's only 4 schools listed here, even though we're examining more schools. And I don't know if you were going to speak to that, but specifically the reason these 4 are listed is there are schools that we already have the surplus designation. So the last 7-11 committee already assigned surplus to Stephen and Pennycook. So we don't need to do that again this round. That's already been designated. But these 4 sites which are being discussed have not received that designation.
That's right. Yeah, there was a 7-Eleven in 2020 and then one in 2024. And so both of those committees have already designated some of the 7 sites that we looked at before as surplus. So we're only bringing these 4 back to you for decision on this second factor. Okay. That's all we have as far as content. Were there any additional questions? The goal again tonight was just to kind of set the stage, right? So you haven't seen a whole lot of data yet, a whole lot of additional information about the individual sites or the options or enrollment. It's just kind of to set the stage on procedure and then the properties themselves and then those 2 asks that the board has made of the committee, so that you can kind of start to think about these options and then we can dive into the data a bit more at the next meeting.
Can you just give me a little bit more clarity on that impact reporting you were talking about?
Yes.
Was it for the schools that had already been closed? Is that what you had said?
So the equity impact analysis was conducted last year in conjunction with the work of the 7-11 committee. It looked specifically at Mare Island Health and Fitness Academy, Vallejo Charter School, which was moved to that campus, Loma Vista, Stephen and Pennycook, I believe, were also part of that report. However, that report was looking one direction, not the option of one going. I'm trying to remember. Don't
think
quote
that's
me,
right.
but
I
I
think
think
that's
it was
right.
either Stephen to Penny was the directionality of that report.
I think that's right, but I can't remember. I would have
And
to go back
so-
double check.
The board at the time did not choose to consolidate Stephen or Penny at that time, but they've asked for it to come back as part of phase 2 for discussion, but this time not to limit the direction from Stefan to Penny, but to have it done both ways. So we can truly analyze what would be the right option if we do consolidate. So all those options, if we go back on the slide, all of that's going to be examined in the equity impact analysis. And that is a requirement. Well, it's interesting. We're in this weird position because we are exiting state receivership, which legally means we don't have that requirement anymore to conduct an equity impact analysis, but it is a best practice. And so we are going to do it anyways because it does show us the data around who's impacted if we close a school. Is it really equitable across our district to do that?
And so
Is that
that,
an- Sorry.
Sorry.
Is that analysis already available on the website or?
no, so that's in process now. Yeah. So we have a contractor that is doing that analysis. It's going to run concurrently with your operations. And then what the board is going to see is at the end, they're going to have your kind of set of recommendations based on the information that you have. And then if that report finds any of the closure options to not be equitable, that would also be presented to the board, right? So what the contractor is looking at is the board has adopted, I think it's 8 different criteria that the contractor has to look at to apply to these different options. And they're looking at not just closure of a site, but closure and the relocation to like a receptor school, or a number of receptor schools. So they're looking at various different like iterations of what you're seeing on the slide. And then based on like application of all those criteria, the final report is going to either say equitable or not equitable. And so if one of those options isn't equitable, that will be flagged for the board. And then they would presumably take that off of their options for the consideration of a closure.
And
How do you define equitable?
It's, oh yeah, sorry.
let's just leave them on.
How do you define equitable?
So it's based on those 8 factors that the board adopted. And those factors are actually from the education code, and they kind of go through different items that have to be looked at. So like, for example, one of them is relocation of certain types of programs from one site to another. So how many like special education programs are there at this site, and how would that impact, how would a like relocation or a consolidation of that program to a different site impact the availability of those programs? Like travel, right? So they'll create like plot maps of, and this kind of goes back to your question about what's the current enrollment look like? Where are those kids living and how far do they travel to get to school? And then there's a like a designated like legal boundary of what's like a fair amount of time to have to walk and or drive to get to school. And so they'll look at, well, if you were to close that site and then consolidate to a second site, how would that change, right? Would there be a very large number of kids that would be outside of that like legal boundary of how far they should have to walk or drive to get to school? They look at things like, like what would the district's plan be for use of those sites if they're not being used for a school? So kind of what's the idea of what that site could be used for alternatively to instructional programs? But it's all based on application of those 8 factors and then kind of, like yes or no depending on that application.
And I do think it's important for the committee to kind of understand where these schools came from. Because this isn't all our schools. And I'll give a little bit of background. So when you look at Lincoln or Federal Terrace, partly the reason they're on this list is size. Lincoln is our smallest school, number of students attending that school. It's also one of our smallest footprints. So it does have a cap on how large that school could be. Federal Terrace is another one of our small schools. I believe they're in the 200 range, just barely around that. So that's part of the reason why they're on the list. Pennycook and Stefan, proximity to neighborhood schools. Those schools are relatively close to each other. That's why they ended up on a list. Finney's the one that's new to this list. Finney as a school complex, and we're going to get into this in later rounds. When we look at potential school sites that could generate revenue for a district, either by leasing or selling a property, John Finney Complex hasn't had the same number of bond dollars used, which does limit what we can do with properties. So John Finney could be a site that potentially generates revenue long-term. So that's why Finney's on here. Not that we necessarily are closing John Finney. We wouldn't necessarily do that. But depending on what dominoes fall, we might have some sites available that we could move Finney to. So it's sort of a lot of moving pieces that make up this puzzle. Highland and Cooper, they're in there just to examine. Doesn't necessarily mean we're going to close those schools, but if we did, what does that look like to our boundaries? And could we absorb those student populations into neighboring schools? We can't do all of this, of course. We can't close Federal and Lincoln and Highland and Cooper. Like, that wouldn't work. So there's some interconnected parts, which is partly why we would create sort of a ranked list.
The other thing that I want to mention on that point is when you think about why, right, like reasons that you would close a school, one would be, if sites are operating at such a low capacity, right, they're, a third or less, or half or less of what they can take, then you have essentially like redundancies, right, in those like operating costs. And so it could make sense to consolidate those two programs into a single like physical site so that you have it fully operational, leaving that empty site open for either like relocation of a different program, or if we haven't used bond dollars and it's in the right place and the right size, it could bring in potential additional like revenue for the district, right? So there's lots of different like motives, right, or like good reasons to think about both the option of consolidation and movement, and then also the idea of like surplusing a site so that it can bring in revenue outside of just housing half or a third of the kids that it did before. And that's where I think seeing the kind of the like trend of declining enrollment, right? So why we have schools that used to be full in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then now are at half or third capacity. And then also seeing the enrollment numbers at those different sites, you kind of start to see how the puzzle pieces come together, right? Like if a site can hold 800 and only has 2, you could see how pulling them together, could save costs and make sense.
Does a condition of the physical plant factor into the analysis?
Like the condition of the facility itself, like how
Yes.
recently has it been updated?
Yes.
Yes. So that's one of the other pieces of data is not only have we spent bond dollars, right? So the reason that we keep kind of calling that out is that bond money is our special in that if they've been spent on that site, we really don't have options to long-term lease or sell those sites to a non-public use because of the potential like tax implications of using bond money on those things, but also just kind of the bigger question, if a site's been updated with other monies, maybe if you have one site that's a little bit newer and one that hasn't been updated, does it make sense to consolidate to the newer site so you're not having to spend money to update facilities at both sites for half the number of kids? Yes. Okay, any other questions? Any specific data? I mean, it's I think maybe hard to ask now because you haven't seen what we have prepared or
Sarah,
the
there's a
plan.
question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
T.
Go ahead.
Needs a mic.
Will we get the data? You said the sort of the data package that we'll be able to get for the next meeting. Will we get that before the meeting, and we'll be able to peruse it or examine it electronically?
Yeah. So the goal will be to get it to you. We'll probably get you the PowerPoint at least the 72 hours in advance. I don't know if staff had plans to get it to you any sooner than that. But the goal will be to get you that material kind of with the agenda and the PowerPoint presentation for the next meeting. But you won't get it like weeks in advance to analyze. But we'll kind of walk through it, and then I'll ask at the next meeting, like, is there any clarification or additional data that you're looking to see? So a little bit in advance is kind of the short answer to your question, but not, like weeks in advance for you to, like deeply analyze, unfortunately, because we're still trying to pull all of the information that we need to get it to you.
Even if it's just like a table of contents, list of what we're gonna get, that would also be super helpful. So that way I can think of, maybe have a chance to think about what data might also be useful or that we might also like to see, or just how we might approach the problem.
Okay, that makes sense. Understood. Thank you. Okay. Anything else? All right, so let's move forward then, and we'll just do the rest of the operations of the committee for tonight. Okay, so on 5C, we talked about the request for additional data and information to be provided and what that's going to look like. So now let's move to our action items. So at this point, we're going to elect. Sorry, Siri was involved. So at this point, we're going to elect or appoint a committee member to act as the chairperson. And what the chairperson will do is essentially kind of take on the role that I've had at this meeting and just kind of walk us through the agenda, and just kind of be the leader of the committee, for lack of a better term. So is there anybody that would like to kind of self-motion to be considered, or would like to appoint someone else? You have questions about what the chairperson would do?
And I would look at your calendars because the dates are there. Make sure, like, if you're going to be the chair, make sure you can make all the meetings.
Good point.
Just
Yes, that would be helpful. Yes, sure.
Makes sense. Would you mind also maybe going into what the other appointee person would
Sure.
do, so that I can make an informed
Yes.
decision?
So in 6B, this is kind of a optional item, but some committees that I have worked with over the years like to have a particular person or two people that will work on some of the like laboring or of the drafting of the report. So I kind of have a draft, like, framework report that I'll provide to the committee, and then usually I'm just kind of the scribe. I'll, hear what's being said by the committee, and then I'll, like, detail the recommendations, and then those will get read back out to the committee in meetings 3 and 4, and then you'll kind of help me adapt my interpretation of what you all have said. Some committees like to have one or two people that are more involved in the drafting of the report outside of the meeting. And we can do that, right? Because it's only one or two people. It's not a majority or quorum of the committee. The past couple committees that I've worked with, no one has wanted to have that type of outside involvement in the drafting, and they felt like it was sufficient to have the draft brought to the committee at these meetings, and then, for example, at like meeting 3, we go through. We move commas. It's my job is really just to draft it to say what the committee wants. But that's what that other role would be, is if one person wants to be really involved in the drafting component of the report.
And can we decide on that later, like at a later meeting? Can we come back to this? We could. In case we don't do it today?
Yes, if you would like for me to put this action item on the next agenda instead of having it on this agenda, we can certainly do that, and then we just won't have elected that person or those people tonight. But ideally, we would have a committee chairperson by our next meeting.
I move that Kat Tejan is our committee chairperson.
That's the not it.
That's the not it. I respectfully decline.
I don't mind doing it if no one else wants to.
I'd like to revise my motion to, I move that Kimberly Marquez Cortez is our committee chairperson.
Can I get a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Second by Sandra. Okay, and then we're going to take a vote, and so I'm going to call each of you individually. This will give me time to practice saying names properly. Okay, Kathleen Salas Teagan.
I approve. Yes.
Okay. Aye or yes. Yeah, either works. Ivana Wheeler.
Aye.
Okay. Sandra Stevens.
Yes.
Christy Gardner.
Aye.
Okay. R. Shay Miles.
Aye.
Okay. Kimberly Marquez Cortez.
No, I was kidding.
T. Lek Ying. Was that right?
Aye.
Okay, okay. And Marnay, hold on, I'll find you. Marnay McKenzie.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so we have a unanimous vote. So we will have Kimberly Marquez Cortez as our chairperson. And you will also sign the final report at the end. Okay. All right, so item 7 just goes through the 3 additional, or really kind of 4 additional dates, right? So our next meeting will be on July 7th. Meeting 3 will be on July 28th. Meeting 4, August the 11th. And then you'll do a final presentation of the committee report to the board at their board meeting on August the 20th. You don't all need to be there at that meeting, but during the 4th meeting, we will talk about, usually the best way to do it is have the chairperson and at least one other person agree to be at the meeting to just kind of present the report and describe to the board the information that you saw and kind of some of the rationale around the findings and recommendations within the report. So we can talk more about what group of you will want to be there on August the 20th. Okay. Anything before I move to adjourn the meeting?
Is there, just so we can see like a bigger picture, is there an opportunity to see how our decisions impact like just the entire process from today to what you were talking about, like equitable or not equitable and what happens? Is there something like that, a timeline that exists for something like that?
So my goal is for the governing board to have a decision on any school closures or consolidation that's coupled with any budget reductions, because we do have budget reductions in the 26-27 school year, by December of 2025. So by December, which is also with the presentation Mr. Fernandez will make with our first interim budget, that's the target for when we want the board to make a decision. So this recommendation, the equity impact analysis report, board study sessions, which you are always invited to attend. Those are open sessions where the board will discuss all the findings, all the information, all the data that will lead them to make a decision by December.
So to kind of add a little bit more to that, right? Your final report's going to go to the board on August 20th. And so they'll have seen the recommendations from the committee. And then the equity impact analysis should come to the board. So that report actually has to go to the board twice. There's a draft that they see, and then there's any revisions, and then it goes back a second time. So we expect that to happen kind of fall, right? So September, October. And then they'll be making their final decisions on closure by December. So it's kind of all of this data that we build up for them, and then that kind of helps them have all the information they need to make a final closure decision by the end of the calendar year.
When will we see the equity impact report?
So we are going to try to have the contractor consultant create components of what they're doing to be able to pull that for you to see, but we likely won't have a fully formed equity impact analysis for the committee to see before you make your final recommendation. And it's just because they are looking, I mean, you saw the number of iterations that they're studying, right? It's like 18 or more options that they're gonna have to study, those 8 factors in comparison to all of those options. And so we are asking them to pull some of the major pieces of that data that we can bring to you so you can see that impact. But ultimately, the idea is you won't necessarily know what the equity result would be of those various options, but the board will see that at the end, right? So they're gonna see that list of those like 1 to 7. And then if any of those options, right, if any of the like iterations for those wouldn't be equitable, the board will then have that data as well. So, you know, they'll know, like say for example, the top school on your list is Pennycook. You decide that's the site that if we had to see a site closed, it would be Pennycook. And then the equity impact analysis comes back and says, well, the move of kids from Pennycook to Stephen isn't equitable, then they would probably move down to your second option on the list, right? They'll use all of that information coming together. Ideally, we would have the equity impact analysis now, right? But that consultant is having to review so many options to give the board as many potential options as possible that we're having to run these two processes at the same time and trying to pull from each to inform the other.
The other factor is school will start this fall. We'll have updated enrollment information. There's a lot of moving pieces. So this is just one component, but it's not the only component.
So in effect, we should not really plan to rely heavily on the equity analysis in making our recommendations because the data will not be crunched in time for us to do that.
Right.
So we're kind of flying in the dark from that perspective.
Well, so yes, in that you will not have a fully formed equity impact analysis to look at, right? But the result of the equity impact analysis is really just to rule out options that can't be done, right? But the board's also not asking you to give them close this school and move to this site, right? It's just saying you're gonna scale from 1 to 7 if a site had to be closed and not necessarily dependent on the relocation option, which one would go first, second, third, et cetera. So you won't see the equity impact analysis in its totality because we'll have, it's happening and then it's being revised constantly. But you will be seeing a lot of the overlap of data that the consultant is looking at in their creation of the equity impact analysis. So they're going to be seeing it for their purposes, you're going to be seeing it for your purposes, and then ultimately both of those results will be sent to the board for them to make that final decision.
So I'll speak for myself, but I'm not sure if maybe the panel feels the same way. I would like to make a very responsible decision. This affects our children first and their families, as well as the community, because a school makes a community as well. So without that report with its most updated information, we're not making a responsible decision from ranking them from 1 to 7, in my mind. So should we then move the second meeting to a later date so that we could give the consultant more time? Or
I think the point that Sarah made, which is the EIA, short for equity impact, the EIA report, what it's truly doing is ruling out a school you can't close. So the options on this list, theoretically, the board could choose any of these options to close. The EIA is going to tell them, sorry, you can't close that school. That's the ultimate goal of the EIA. Because the original intent of that report was by the Attorney General to make sure you didn't necessarily close a school that would impact one demographic group very severely, right? So there's very specific things about that report. But it's telling us what we can't do.
And to clarify, it's not even necessarily telling us that we can't close the school. It's saying you can't close this one and relocate it to this site, right? So one of those iterations with all the shapes and the colors, right, where there are different options, the EIA is looking at each of those, right? The closure school, the receptor school, over and over and over again, and analyzing what that move is going to look like. So you're just ranking the sites that are being closed, not necessarily opining on the receptor school. And then they're going to come in at the end and say, or not at the end, but they're going to bring in additional information and say, that particular iteration of that option isn't an option. And to be quite honest, we don't even know that they're going to say that about any of the options. We think most of them are fairly equitable based on just kind of staff review of those factors. And that's why those iterations were brought forward, because we've done some initial review of those options. But so I say that to say, the result of the EIA isn't going to necessarily null what you've decided, right? You're still giving them a priority list of if we have to close a site, these are the ones in order of our preference. And then the result of the EIA is going to be helping them narrow those 20 like iterations of options.
Is there visibility into the 8 goals or criteria, those factors that you were talking about? Because I'm thinking even knowing what those are may help us, especially when we see the data in our next meeting,
Yes.
help us correlate, match some things up. Just having some visibility into what those 8 goals are for
Yes.
that EIA. Just to help us make more informed decisions. I'm not sure what we're really allowed to do. Are we allowed to make site visits? I don't know. But just understanding, just giving us a way to make more informed decisions.
Yes, so those 8 factors were board adopted, so I'm more than happy as like some of the data that we bring, we can explain like kind of what those 8 factors are, and then even describe how they're being looked at, right? Like kind of, like what they mean. That's definitely information that we can provide at the second meeting. Yep.
What is the final product for the equity impact analysis? Is it a binary, yes or no, or is it like a score out of 100 points, or is it more?
Yeah, it's a really long report, probably several hundreds of pages based on the number of iterations. It's not. It's more of a yes or no. It's not scored like numerically, but they'll break down each. So they'll start with each like iteration of closure and like relocation school. They'll explain what it would look like, and then they'll break down each of the 8 factors and explain the implication, and then they'll kind of like come to a conclusion, like on the whole, right? So maybe not all 8 factors go the right direction, but a majority of those 8 factors look equitable, and then they'll come to a conclusion that says, like, on the whole, we think this would be equitable based on our analysis. And then part of the utility of the 2 meetings for the EIA is that draft is brought to the board. There's a public hearing. The community can come and comment and kind of ask questions. So when this happened in phase 1, there were questions from the board and the community about, well, help us understand exactly how that criteria was being applied to this particular like iteration. And then we, kind of flush some of that out. But the short answer is it's kind of a yay or nay, but it's in the like cumulative of all those factors being analyzed.
I'm sorry if I missed this. What fiscal year would this go into effect?
26, 27. So any of the board decisions, which the target date of December, would impact the following school year. And also, the goal is to give staff and community a long enough time to have that decision made by December.
Do you happen to have a code site for those?
Oh, for the EIA?
Uh-huh,
Not off the top of my head, but I can definitely get that to you.
that'd be good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So we will move to adjourn. So can I get a motion to adjourn this first meeting of the 7-Eleven committee?
So moved.
Okay. Can I get a second?
I'll second.
Okay, and we're gonna run through the vote one more time. Kathleen Salas-Teakin.
Aye.
Ivana Wheeler.
Aye.
Sandra Stevens.
Aye.
Christy Gardner.
Aye.
R. Shea Miles.
Aye.
Kimberly Marquez Cortez.
Aye.
T. Lek Ying.
Aye.
And Marnay McKenzie.
Aye.
Okay, thank you all, appreciate it. Oh, yes, your name tag in your folder would be helpful.